Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Laufel, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The ANWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrence and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another great episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a great guest. Tim Nank is a former Naval Intelligence Officer, National Security Council staffer. He's had a number of positions across the nuclear enterprise, and we thought we would talk about tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, for the listeners, you know that's one of my favorite topics. I think I had an article a week or so ago, the return of battlefield nuclear weapons. And so what better to do than have a podcast and talk about that with somebody else who spent some time looking at the topic. So Tim, welcome to NucleCast.
All right, great. Thanks, Adam. Glad to be here.
So you too are interested in tactical nuclear weapons. Some people call them non-strategic, some people call them tactical, I've called them battlefield, depending on the types and delivery systems. So how is it, as you think about tactical nuclear weapons, sort of where are you coming down and what's your view as we move into a sort of a more dangerous world?
Yeah, exactly. Certainly a more dangerous world is the key phrase there. I too enjoy tactical nuclear weapons. I think that they are amazing development over the course of time. I think in the 1960s is when they, maybe even earlier than that, it might have been the mid-50s, is when they first started taking notice of their use and their effective level and what they could do. And I think I'll just start by saying I first like the tactical nuclear weapons is because of the advantages that they have. The fact that they're mobile, that they can be deployed sea, air, and land in any kind of capacity. And I'm really referring to the history of the tactical nuclear weapons. When I say sea, air, and land, I'm thinking about the Davy Crockett, which I think was the W-54, which was a shot from basically a gun, and it had a 0.01 to 1 kiloton yield and could travel 2.5 miles. Or the backpack, this SADM, special, demolition munition. I think
special atomic demolition.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
The backpack could be in a parachute, or you land on sea, air. Like I said, sea, air, or land. I think that those are fantastic. I love the fact that they can be mobile, that they can be. Some of them can be set to what detonation, what level of yield that they want to have. They can be carried, they can be dropped, they can be shot, they can come off of a missile. So I think that they're very advantageous, and I hesitate in saying this a little bit, but a little surprised that with the smaller yields, why they haven't been used. Again, I say that with some hesitancy, but it would seem like something like that would be advantageous to some of these countries that are out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. So I wrote an article talking about ultra low yield and low yield weapons here recently, and I got some pushback, a lot of times from folks in DC that tend to be on the arms control and disarmament side.
Sure.
And the first argument is, well, all nukes are strategic, and so therefore you can't say that, these are more usable than a 150 kiloton ICBM because, they're all the same. A nuke is a nuke is a nuke, regardless of whether it's a high or low yield. That's sort of one of the pushbacks I get. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that what you said, excuse me, I'm sorry. That point of being that they're all strategic, I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree with that. I think that there are some things, I think some of these tactical nuclear weapons are actually tactical, are actually, there's a reason why they're built and why they, well, not that they're used because they haven't been used, but why they would be used. Decision makers or leaders have mission objectives, and they're like, what could we use? How could we take out this airfield? How could we take this supply route or this bridge or something like that and cause the most amount of damage? Or the bunker busters or the earth penetrators. That's another strategic, another possibility that a tactical nuclear weapon could possibly use. But yeah, I agree.
It'll be interesting. The U.S. Yesterday was the 17th, so yeah, it would have been yesterday. We sent B-2s
Yeah,
to attack Houthi, hardened and deeply buried targets,
yeah,
and
I
we
saw.
use conventionals, and so it'll be interesting to see how successful those conventionals were. Could they cause the kind of damage that is required, or do you need a vehicle or a weapon that produces more yield?
Yeah,
And if people remember, the largest conventional weapon we have is a GBU-43, and that GBU-43 is 11 tons,
yeah,
so
yeah,
0.01 uh,
yeah.
kilotons. And so, do we need more? Something
That that's
larger?
interesting too. I thought about that yesterday, or the other day. Yeah, yesterday is like there's an economic factor also. How much does the U.S. or any country for that matter want to spend on building a tactical nuclear weapon versus multiple conventional weapons, and then what's the benefit or what do you get out of that? Will you get more of a destruction level with how, especially with those tactical nuclear weapons where you can adjust the yield? What do you want to get from that, and how much you want to put money into it?
Yeah, it's interesting. We did myself and another couple of guys wrote an article in the Air Force's professional journal, Ether, maybe a year ago, I guess. And we looked at I think it's called Nuclear Apples and Conventional Oranges, something like that. And we looked at an airfield, and we looked at a B-2 laying down a conventional attack and what it would take to destroy, a Russian airfield. And it
Yeah,
takes about 80 conventionals, but you could do it with 5 low yield tactical
yeah.
nuclear weapons. So the idea that they really don't have
What's the price on that?
yeah, yeah. Well, and what can you carry?
Yeah,
How many times do you have to hit a field? And when does your conventional, when do you go Winchester with your conventional capabilities? Because if you look at like our conventional um, cruise missiles, our buy,
yeah,
if we were going to buy, JASM and JASM ER, we'll never buy enough of them to hit all the targets with conventional munitions. So
right.
tactical weapons are going to be a fallback position.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A fallback position. I like how you say that, and I wonder what that means exactly in the future when we're looking at, Russia and Ukraine. We're looking at Israel and Iran or Houthi. The Israel Iran, well, the Israel situation, and then of course China Taiwan. Taiwan I think is 100 miles off their coast, and Japan is 1,000 miles. And North or South Korea is right next door. So it's just like, in terms of delivery mechanisms, you don't need anything that's going to travel far, and you don't need anything that's to take out an airfield, as per your example. You don't need a large weapon to do that, large nuclear weapon, excuse me, to do that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I don't know if this is something you and let's say the NSC and other really think through is the idea of the weapons effects of these like tactical nukes, because if you read Annie Jacobson's book, which is a terrible book by the way, it's really inaccurate. Any use of a single weapon leads to all out nuclear war, and then any yield destroys everything. And I sometimes wonder, like, hey, do y'all understand that we've already, in the US, in Nevada, we detonated a couple of hundred above ground nuclear
Yeah,
weapons, and
yeah,
yet it hasn't destroyed Nevada, it hasn't poisoned the air, water. I remember being on Frenchman Flats and picking up the dirt and smelling it. And there was 156, I think it was 156 nuclear tests on above Frenchman Flats.
Oh, really?
And
I didn't know that.
so, yeah. So, and, if you look at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they're all repopulated. So I wonder if people really have an accurate sense of what weapons effects are.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know if this goes into our next portion or if this is even a next portion, but one of the things I've also thought about, should they be used? And because of their low yield, and when you talk about your experience at Frenchman Flats, and you bring up Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and 90 years later or whatever it's been, or 80 years, whatever, and with the leaders that we're talking about today, you wonder to what extent would they go to save face, and I'm really referring to Putin and Ukraine in that situation, or to accomplish their mission objectives. I'm now talking about Iran or Israel, and then also Taiwan and China. To what extent will this leader look at using a tactical nuclear weapon to achieve their mission objectives, and then what would they obviously would have to consider the repercussions of something like that as well. So I find that fascinating. I would love for a paper, someone to do on those three leaders, of those leaders of those aforementioned countries, and what someone would think, that to what extent would they go to use a nuclear weapon, and also thinking of the repercussions that they might have from more than likely the United States.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's one of those things, because we haven't really ever fought a nuclear war. I mean, we dropped two, but we've never actually fought a nuclear war. So therefore, how will people respond? We've done lots of wargaming. So we often know, what does the American intelligence community, who always plays the red team, how do they think the red team will act, which will certainly be far different from the way the red team actually acts. And it's one where we're very reluctant, because, when you're a status quo power like us, you don't have any desire for things to change. And then you want to rush back to the, antebellum status quo. And so I just wonder if we're seeing this really wrong because of our own perceptions and blind spots.
Yeah.
As you've sort of thought through this and tried to discuss it within government, what are what's the perceptions and the views sort of across the various agencies and leadership that you've dealt with, in terms of how they see them, the applicability of them, and how they see our adversaries thinking about them?
Yeah, that's a hard question, to be honest with you. I would first start off by saying I remember a captain, a U.S. Navy captain, whose last name I can't remember, but his name is Mack, I believe. He says there's never a zero possibility, right? I mean, it's a possibility. It could happen. And I think that everybody kind of thinks like it's unlikely, but there's always that possibility. And I think the general community, and are you referring to, is the questions with tactical nuclear weapons? If
Sure.
they should? Yeah. As I said at the very beginning, I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't happened. I think, with minimal deaths, minimal radiation, and huge benefits of taking out airfields and bridges and supply routes and infrastructure and things like that, I'm a little surprised that it hasn't happened. And again, I say that with some hesitancy, because I'm not encouraging it. I'm not necessarily encouraging it, but I'm kind of wondering how those leaders, our foreign leaders, think about them, and if they would use them. And then getting back to your question, I'm not sure how the general community thinks about it. I don't know how our decision makers here in the United States would think about actually using a tactical nuclear weapon, or the repercussions or the response of a nuclear, or a tactical nuclear weapon, being deployed.
Yeah, it was interesting. I'm sure you heard, it was 2 weeks ago now, I think, that the head of MI6 and the head of CIA I think they were in London.
Yeah.
And they talked about how close Russia was to using a nuclear weapon when they're at the NATO in November of 2022. And, there's that closeness apparently. And apparently we were talking to the Russians and saying, hey, we're watching, we know what you're thinking, we know what you're doing, don't do this. And, they didn't. But I've tried to think through what would actually happen if Russia used a nuclear weapon, let's say in Ukraine. Would we start flowing troops? Would we say, well, we wouldn't exercise Article 5 of NATO? What would we do? And then would that kick off? I don't think it would kick off a broader nuclear exchange, but that's just me.
I don't know. I mean, once you use it, I mean, in that scenario, I would think that, if we were to move troops in or take some sort of aggressive action or response, he's used it once. What's preventing him from using it again? You kind of open the threshold, which is the concern about using tactical nuclear weapons, because once you've used them, who's to say they're not going to use again? And we certainly have tactical nuclear weapons that we could respond in kind. But for some of those countries that don't have nuclear weapons and have the larger strategic nuclear weapons, are they obligated or feel compelled to use those? I mean, because you got to do some sort of response, and I'm not sure ground troops and a whole mess of conventional weapons is necessarily going to answer the question, right? I mean, you have to come from a position of strength. I think any country does. And I'm not referring necessarily to the United States, but
yeah. Now we're in that time in the show where we have to take a quick break.
Okay.
So you're listening to Nuclecast, and we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Tim Nank. We've been sort of discussing the role and use of tactical nuclear weapons. So, Tim, you've worked this issue, and, we sort of talked a little bit about possible utility. And were there other elements or aspects of it that you thought that the Nuclecast listeners really need to understand on this topic?
About tactical nuclear weapons? Yeah, I told you at the beginning, I really think that these weapons are fascinating and have so many advantages. I think the mobility is key. They can be transported in a variety of different ways, whether it's a launcher, whether, it's by truck, or it's from air or from sea. I mentioned the SADM, the backpack. I mentioned the Davy Crockett. There's the obviously the gravity bombs, the B-61, I believe. I think that has a 0.3 to 340 kilotons, something to that range. The MGM-18 Lacrosse launcher and its launcher, there's those kind of weapons. And the thing about these is that I like about them is not only the mobility, but you can adjust the yield to some of these to what you want the outcome to be. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had 5,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Europe when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. They were removed and decommissioned, and now we've got fewer than 200 B-61s in Europe that are they're going to be put on F-35s. But when we did have backpack nukes, and we had Glickem, and we had Pershing II, and so we had a sort of a large array of options that we could have used, and the Russians were scared of that.
Yeah.
And I wonder nowadays, I'm not so certain they're scared of what we have in Europe, for example, or like in Asia, which is sort of even in a worse position. All we have are, a few submarines that could potentially shoot Triton D5s, at North Korea or China or whomever. And I'm not sure that's sufficient, a sufficient number of options and a sufficient number of configurations that we really can effectively deter, this axis of Russia, China, and North Korea. How do you see it?
What do you mean? You mean, are you asking like how those other countries are relating to each other with weapons over there? Or
Well, the fact that we have so little, and in essentially we have
well,
F-35s in Europe, and then really nothing in Asia,
yeah,
except a strategic option.
yeah. Well, I look at nuclear weapons. I think all nuclear weapons, first and foremost, provide such a huge deterrence value and a safety net for allies. I think that's something that is a huge advantage to anyone that has a nuclear weapon. I With tactical nuclear weapons and the less that we have, I understand. I remember that movie, The Sum of All Fears, and I think it was Morgan Freeman who said it only takes one. And that's really what it is. It really only takes one large nuclear weapon to create a lot of damage. And do we need to build more? I would say yes, especially in the tactical nuclear weapon area, and I would I would encourage building more diverse kind of weapons and exploration into what capabilities we could come up with, what kinds of tactical nuclear weapons. So I think that the buildup is something we should do, and deployment within various parts of the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many more strategic nuclear weapons we need,
That
but
might be true.
the tactical, and the Russians they've got more tactical weapons than they have strategic.
Yeah, I know.
And the Chinese are sort of building both.
Yeah.
And just, the North Koreans have done that as well. And we'll see ultimately what Iran does. But as we build and think through these capabilities, do you see the Russians and the Chinese as seeing tactical or low yield weapons as being fundamentally different than strategic nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that when they look at their enemies or the people that they're dealing with, I think that they do look at them differently. I think everybody does to some degree because they offer different benefits. They have different mission objectives. One of the things was trying to define, we talked about this in the beginning, we're trying to define tactical nuclear weapons. There's really no universal term or definition that I found that really defines what a tactical nuclear weapon is. And you were talking about strategic versus non-strategic in the beginning. But I think that countries can define, well, this would be a tactical nuclear weapon and this would be more of a strategic weapon. And they would then determine, depending on what kind of outcome they want, what they want to deploy. The big thing is how does that decision making process go down? What do they come up with, and then do they also consider the repercussions of probably more likely a response from the United States?
Now, it's that time in the show where I like to pull out. I don't know if you've ever met Bob, the genie, but Bob, he comes
right.
out and I rub my magic lamp, and then Bob grants 3 wishes to all guests.
Oh, geez.
So now, Tim, you have 3 wishes, but they got to be on the, no money, no fame, none of that kind of stuff. It's got to relate to the topics of discussion. So, Tim, as Bob grants you your first wish, what is that first wish?
And is this is in the frame of the discussion?
Correct. So,
3 wishes?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Well, I would say more testing. I would say more development, and more probably exploration of what kind of tactical nuclear weapons we could use. And I'd say, more development. So that those 3 things.
Yeah. Okay. So testing and development, I'm with you, building, new and additional tactical weapons, which I actually think is really sort of where our big gap is. Yeah. And so therefore trying to fill that gap such that the adversary doesn't think that they can have a fiat accompli by, shooting through the gap. In some respects, it's like football. Your adversary, you're looking for their gaps, and they're looking for yours. And you try to fill those gaps. That's how you succeed. And so you got to, fill the gap so they don't shoot through them. Okay. So that's number 1. Do you have a second wish?
With regard to tactical nuclear weapons, Oh my gosh, you really kind of put me on the spot. I was not prepared for these three wishes. Well, let me turn it on. What would you say?
If it were me, in addition to building and fielding additional tactical nuclear weapons, what I would really like to see is I would like to see a wide scale effort by, the military, by DITRA, by all these sort of folks that know and understand nuclear weapons, to get out and share with the American public why we need them, what they do. I mean, that's sort of the whole point of ANWA, is to build that public understanding and education, but to share with the public what we do, why we do it, how it works, and demystify some of the truths of nuclear employment, such that Americans don't have, a view that one nuclear weapon will destroy the world and we'll have global winter and then the sky will burn. And I mean, all of these things that are really just not accurate, but because they're sort of scintillating. And I say that for my science friends, they're scintillating to hear, people sort of believe it because it's sort of that worst case. And so what I'd want to do is inform the public so they're not sort of bought by the Hollywood version of things.
That's interesting. So, are you promoting nuclear weapons as a uh, uh, as a solution or a tool to
Well, they do have a role, but you're also informing the public so that they understand, the truths of their existence and use and utility and all that.
That's interesting.
And then that would be an important thing for, Americans to know so that they're demystified.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. In the early 2000s, even up until 2010, nuclear weapons were talked a lot about, and then it just kind of falled off the radar. And then COVID hit, and then it became biochem discussions of using that, and then nuclear weapons just aren't really talked about anymore as much. So that's interesting.
It tends to be sort of the nuclear folks inside the nuclear enterprise are debating and discussing folks in the disarmament community. And it's these two very niche groups that are talking about it. Whereas the American public is like, yeah, I think we still have them.
Yeah.
And they're really destructive, but that's about as far sort of as deep as the discussion goes. So, okay, well, let me give you your third. Now
I guess my third, and I don't know if this applies or not, but I am concerned about some of these countries that do have or that are building nuclear weapons and their rationale and their justification of why they would use them. And I guess my third would be some sort of enhanced effort to discourage or to prevent or deter or whatever these countries from using them. Because I do believe that at some point, maybe not in my lifetime, but I think at some point we will see a nuclear weapon being used. And I'm fearful of that day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think any of us want their use, but depending upon how that event goes, it might be the use of one or a small number. And, we kind of move on.
Yeah.
And we say, geez, and then you got to wonder, like, if you use a small number and it sort of has a limited effect, like it probably would, then does that make them even more useful and more likely to be used in the future? So that's the challenge of dealing with topics where you really have very little experience, right? Is you don't have a, as they might say, a large N in your research to go back and look at all of the examples and then, run analysis on. So we sort of are all armchair nuclear strategists, like, Thomas Schelling said.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic.
So as we sort of wrap up,
sure,
what would you want your takeaway message for the Nuclecast audience to be?
Oh, that's interesting too. I guess the takeaway message is to pay attention to. I remember when I first heard about tactical nuclear weapons, and I first read about it. I'm like, "What are these? What are they talking about?" This is like 20 years ago, and I'm like, "Wow, this could really prove to have some advantages in its use if countries started to develop these." And I would just say that people should pay attention to tactical nuclear weapons. They just talked about it in the Wall Street Journal yesterday when they were talking about Iran possibly using a nuclear weapon and its advantages. And I would just say people pay attention to this. When they talk about them in papers or articles or publications, because I think it's something that is going to increase in development, and therefore it could possibly be used. Because, as I said, there's so many advantages to have them, and having a tactical nuclear weapon with a low yield or adjustable yield to take out infrastructure or supply routes or strategic whatever. I have a feeling that they could and would be used at some point, especially with these hotbed countries that are so pissed off. It's just like, at some point they're going to come to a boiling level, and I think that they might use them. I do. Again, maybe not my lifetime, but I think that it could happen.
All right. Tim Nank, thanks for joining us on Nuclecast.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it.
And thanks to you, the listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode. Well, it was good to talk to somebody who, like me, sees the utility and relevance of tactical nuclear weapons, and clearly distinguishing that they are, not the same as strategic, because I don't buy the all nukes are nukes, and that's, I think that's probably inaccurate. And I certainly know that the Russians and Chinese don't think that way. So it's good to hear somebody who also sort of has a different perspective on it.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it, and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclecast.